few days ago, a guy called Dan Corder published a video on YouTube and on Twitter or X in which he attempts to discredit the campaign against farm murders. His argument seems to be that farm murders do not constitute genocide, and because it does not constitute genocide, it is not a cause worth campaigning for, and those who are involved with this campaign should not be taken seriously, partly because they are white supremacists. Now, at first, I thought it was better just to ignore the video until I realized that this guy is actually a host on the 5FM breakfast show, and I saw that the video did get quite some traction. So in the light thereof, I have decided that it might be worth recording a reaction to that video. Also, I did respond to this guy, I think twice. On different places on X, and said to him, listen, you made some good points, but I'd be happy to discuss this with you. But it's for some reason always the case with these people that they have no interest in having a discussion on the topic. So I'm going to do a reaction to that. Not so much a reaction to the video as such, but just a overview of the situation of farm murders with some references to this video that tries to discredit the whole thing, and then to explain in short form or in summary why this is such a serious crisis and why it should be taken seriously and why the campaign against farm murders is a worthy cause. Now just think about what I just said for a moment. The zeitgeist in South Africa and the world at the moment is as such that if you campaign against the brutal torture and killing of farmers in South Africa who are predominantly white farmers, you have to explain to people that your campaign against this phenomenon or this horrific scourge affecting South Africa's farms is a worthy cause. You have to defend yourself against people who are trying to discredit you, who are trying to paint you as a white supremacist and so forth. It's really, really shocking, and it says a lot about the situation we are in, not just in South Africa, but in the world today. And this strange spirit of the times where if you are on a certain side of the political spectrum, and if the people you are targeting are white, to call it as it is, then you pretty much have a blank check to do and say whatever you want. But if you are campaigning for a certain section of community not to be targeted, and they are not the designated group, so to speak, then you are going to have an uphill battle all the way. So with that, let's get started. So with this video, I want to give you an overview of the farm murders crisis with reference to several aspects thereof. Firstly, I want to talk about the numbers, the statistics, and the difficulty in the statistics. Secondly, the tortures, the extreme levels of violence. Thirdly, the consequences thereof, or the impact on society at large. Then number 4, the unique circumstances in which farmers are. Number 5, the political reality with regard to farm attacks and farm murders, which includes the reaction to the campaign to stop farm murders. Then number 6, the link with hate speech in South Africa. Number 7, the way the media responds to farm murders. And then number 8, going forward. Now obviously this is a long list, so I'm not going to go into the detail with each one. I'm just going to give you the quick overview. So firstly, with regard to the statistics. So when we talk about crime phenomena such as these, it's usually calculated as a victim rate per 100,000 people per year. In order to calculate that number, you need to know how many people are there who could potentially be victims of this crime, and then you need to calculate how many people have actually been victims of this crime. You can do the calculation then and boil it down to how many were there per 100,000. What makes farm attacks and farm murders in particular difficult is that anyone can potentially be a victim of a farm murder. You don't have to live on a farm. I live in the city. I can go to a farm and be a victim of a farm murder. So if you do that division, that calculation, the question is what number do you put at the bottom? And so to try to make the calculation easier, what AfriForum and the Institute for Security Studies and TAUSA and all these organizations who work with this have discovered is that it's easier to determine a farmer murder rate. The reason why is we can roughly estimate how many farmers are there in South Africa, and then we can see during a particular year not how many farm murders were there, but how many of the farm murders were the actual farmers who were murdered. So if you determine how many farmers, how many commercial farmers were murdered, which means not all the victims of farm murders, only those who are the actual commercial farmers, and you have a number for how many commercial farmers are there, then you can calculate a number. Another problem with this is that we don't know exactly how many commercial farmers are there, because as has been pointed out in Dan Corder's video, and as AfriForum and all of the organizations I've mentioned has referenced several times in the past, so this isn't a new argument or a new addition to the discussion, is that the number with regard to how many farmers there are is pretty old. world, and it's not the best possible number that we can work with. Now, while there isn't a better number, because there isn't a credible, more recent number with regard to how many commercial farmers are there. The Department of Agriculture has said several years ago that there are 32,000 farmers in South Africa, roughly speaking. So if, for example, 100 farmers who were commercial farmers were murdered in a year, you can make that calculation. If you ensure that you don't count, for example, a wife of the farmer or someone visiting the farm or something to that effect. Now, yes, this number isn't the best possible number because it's fairly old. What we also do know is that the amount of commercial farmers in South Africa have been declining consistently for probably 50 years. In the 1980s, there were more than 100,000 commercial farmers in South Africa. At some stage, it was said, I think in the 90s, that there was something in the 90 or 60,000 commercial farmers. And now about 10 years ago, it was said that there are 30,000 commercial farmers. This doesn't mean that all of them have been murdered, but it does point to realities on farms and with regard to commercial farming in South Africa, with the amount of farmers becoming fewer because of economics of scale and farmers having to upscale and thus buying out other farms in order for them to continue farming. So the fact that there are difficulties with the number doesn't mean that it's useless. You can still work with plausible range estimates in terms of calculating what the farmer murder rate is. Now, the world average murder rate is about 5 or 6 people per 100,000 per year. So out of every 100,000 people in the world, on average 6 are murdered every year. In South Africa, that murder rate used to be around 34 per 100,000, and it is now up to close to 40. I think it might be just above 40 per 100,000 per year. So it's extremely high already. Now, working with plausible range estimates, I want to reference this by reading a section from my book, Kill the Boer. And the reason why I'm reading this is just to point out that we've dealt with this issue of the difficulty with the numbers, and that this new video that has been circulated trying to discredit this campaign does not really add something new to the discussion. So let me read to you from Kill the Boer, page 44 up to 45. It should be noted that these calculations are not entirely scientific for the reasons provided above. The size of the numbers involved also makes this type of calculation at best an indication rather than a scientifically acceptable ratio, says Burger. That's Johan Burger from the Institute of Security Studies. Gareth Newham, head of the Governance, Crime and Justice Division of the ISS, adds, I do not really know how one could get an accurate estimate of the number and attack rate on farms given the complexities involved. Nonetheless, it remains a broad indication and the best attempt to date to calculate a ratio at which farmers are murdered. The notion that it is near impossible to calculate a farm murder rate has also been expressed by the fact-checking organization AfricaCheck. AfriForum is, however, of the opinion that it is not impossible to reach plausible range estimates, especially for the rate at which commercial farmers are murdered. These calculations should be based on the number of likely commercial farmers and the proportion of the victims of farm murders who are in fact the commercial farmers, as I have explained. In an analysis, this is an example, of 1,937 victims of farm murders by Tau SA, the organization has indicated that 1,255 or 64.8% of the victims were the farmers themselves. We might, for example, use a breakdown by ANI, that's the AfriForum Research Institute, for the financial year of 2016 to 2017, which revealed that 43 of the 74 farm murders committed in that year occurred on farms as opposed to small holdings. So it's cutting out small holdings as well to get to a more accurate figure. We can then multiply that number by 64.8%, which is, according to this Tau study, the percentage of victims who are the farmers themselves, to reach a closer estimate of the number of victims who were in fact farmers and not families, visitors or laborers. We can then estimate the number of commercial farmers to be somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000. This is a guess, just for the sake of calculating the number. Considering all of these, the farmer murder rate for that year could be estimated to be somewhere between 79.6 and 92.9 per 100,000. So yes, there are difficulties with the number, but that does not make the numbers useless. Working with plausible range estimates, it's quite evident that the farmer murder rate is much higher than the general murder rate in South Africa, which is much higher than the world average murder rate. So we are dealing with a serious crisis. And saying that this is a serious crisis is not saying that this is a genocide. And trying to convince the world that this is not a genocide and therefore it should not be taken seriously is disingenuous and, I would say, immoral. So having spent some time on the numbers, because that was a large part of the debate recently, I'm going to try to go quicker over the other aspects. Secondly, I want to talk about the tortures. Now, tortures and gratuitous levels of violence have become a regular or a common phenomenon during farm attacks. There have been some studies with regard to what the percentage are of farm attacks during which people have been tortured, and it's extremely high. There are also a variety of torture methods that have become regular activities during farm attacks and farm murders, which include strangling, dragging of victims up and down during the farm attack through the house, oftentimes with a cord or a rope or something tied around the neck, stuffing things down victims' throats, burning them alive, burning them with boiling water, burning them with cooking oil, burning them with melted plastic, dismembering, cutting off limbs and so forth, fingers, drowning of victims, having the victims watch as their loved ones are raped or attacked or killed, beating victims with multiple items including pipes and so forth, stoning of victims, using garden equipment such as garden forks, machetes and so forth to attack the victims, stabbing and so forth. The list goes on. The levels of violence that we see with this crime phenomenon is extreme. And still we have people trying to convince us that this is just crime and we should not be concerned about this because we should be concerned about all crime. Yes, we are concerned about all crime, but you can never try to discredit a campaign to try and have a particular and a very unique crime phenomenon addressed by saying you should be concerned about all crime. It's malicious and once again, it's immoral. So number 3, the consequences or the impact of these attacks. There have been some attempts to calculate what the impact of farm attacks are on the economy, and it's quite difficult to do that, and I'm not going to go into the detail with regard to that now, but I can make a few quick comments. One is that rural towns in South Africa are largely dependent on the economics of farms. And if farms in South Africa die out, surrounding rural towns, the rural towns die out as well. Or if they don't die out, they become severely poor. And the people struggle in those towns. And you can see this happening in towns, in rural towns all over South Africa. Some attempts have been made to calculate, as I said, the economic impact. The difficulty with this includes the fact that different farms have different crops and produces and so forth. But one way to look at it is that the consequence of a farm murder is more or less the same as the consequence of a wealthy person or an employer leaving the country or immigrating. Why is this? Because farmers are generally skilled people, they are generally well-educated people, they are generally employers, and so if they leave the country, we have employers leaving the country. And so yes, politically speaking, we have some people celebrating this, but the consequences thereof is less jobs, more poverty, and ironically, more inequality. So if we are serious about addressing poverty, unemployment, and inequality, one way to address this is to fix the farm murder crisis. The 4th point I want to discuss is the unique circumstances, and the reason why I believe this is important is because even if all the other things I say in this video are irrelevant, this point alone should be sufficient reason for the South African police and the authorities and the government and people like these commentators who try to discredit the campaign to concede and say we need a unique and a focused counter strategy. So farmers live in unique circumstances because they are far away from their neighbors, they are far away from police stations, they are far away from local towns and far away from hospitals. On many of these farms there are long dirt roads and it takes quite some time to get to the actual farmhouse. On many of these farms there are problems with cell phone signals and so forth. So this alone, just the uniqueness of the circumstances already indicates to us that there needs to be a different approach to addressing these problems. You cannot try to prevent farm attacks and farm murders the same way that you try to prevent people from attacking each other in the suburbs, in the city, because of all these different factors and different circumstances. And now, yes, you might say, well, there is a rural safety strategy in South Africa, and indeed so there is. There are 2 problems with the rural safety strategy. The first is that there's no recognition of farm attacks and farm murders as a crisis in South Africa in that document. It just talks about safety in rural areas in general. So it could be much better framed and much more accurate or pinpointed or spearheaded, you might say, to say here is a particular crime phenomenon, these are the characteristics of it, and as a result of these characteristics, this is what we need to do to prevent this from happening. It's also quite reactive in the sense that there aren't really proactive steps to prevent this from happening, at least on a larger scale. Yes, there's talk about patrols and so forth, but not about actually finding the root source of the problem. problem. That's the one criticism. The other criticism to the rural safety strategy is that it's just a document somewhere in a shelf. It's not being implemented. Having discussed the unique circumstances, the fifth point I want to get to is the political reality with regard to farm murders. There are many unique crimes in South Africa that deserve a unique and focused counter strategies, or put differently, that deserve to be regarded and treated as priority crimes, and many of them are indeed treated as priority crimes. Rhino poaching is one example. Copper cable theft is another example. Gang-related violence is another example. Violence against women and children, and so forth. And it's not controversial to say that these crime phenomena have to be treated as a unique crime and that there has to be a focused counter strategy. I don't really know of anyone who has ever argued that rhino poaching should not be a priority crime, or that the campaign to stop rhino poaching is somehow disrespectful to elephants that are also poached, or anything to that effect. There's universal recognition that it's a unique crime phenomenon, it has unique consequences, and there has to be a unique counter strategy. But not when it comes to farm murders. Why? Because it is a politically loaded issue. And why is it a politically loaded issue? Not because of the people campaigning to have it stopped, but because of the priorities of the people who do not want to respond to this. Why is this? Because there's a zeitgeist, as I have said earlier, or a broad mainstream narrative in South Africa that everything that has to do with white people are bad, that white people are oppressors, and that black people by definition are victims. And so if you concede that this particular crime phenomenon is serious, we also have to concede that this crime phenomenon in which a disproportionate amount of the victims are white is serious, and by implication that the broad narrative that white people are bad and farmers are bad, people who own land are bad, is not quite as true as they would like it to be. So to concede that farm murders is a serious problem is to concede that this mainstream overarching narrative about race relations in South Africa and the way it is maintained by the government, and I have to add by the mainstream media, most in the mainstream media, or at least many in the mainstream media, that this narrative is dishonest. Also, what makes this crime phenomenon unique is that we have people and we have politicians and government leaders actively encouraging these attacks, actively romanticizing these attacks by chanting about how this crime phenomenon should happen, how it should be escalated. I've never heard a politician chanting that more rhinos have to be poached. You won't see disciplinary action taken against a member of the ANC or the EFF that promotes farm murders. So we have this crime phenomenon that is very serious, and then we have politicians actively encouraging it while denying that it exists. Government reaction usually, especially the government and some in the media, the reaction to this is usually one of three things. It's either denial, as we saw with President Ramaphosa speaking in New York, saying that this problem doesn't exist, and we see the same thing now and then by some people in the media and other politicians. Julius Malema as well said that farm murders don't exist, there are no killings of white farmers. The second is downplaying, and that's what we saw with this Dan Corder video as well, is trying to severely downplay the extent of the problem, trying to convince us that it's not something that should be taken seriously. Even though it does exist, it's not really something that we should be concerned about. And then the fourth, or the third at least, is even worse than the other two, which is justifying why these murders are taking place. And I have to add that this is also what Dan Corder did in his video when he said, yes, we have to remember that the majority of people in this country are black and they are poor, and the minority are white and they are wealthy, and so we are going to have these attacks. Somehow, so what's the solution to a statement like that? Is it to say that white people should just give up the stuff that they've been working for? Is the solution to have some form of a communist system, to try and implement what Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong and Robert Mugabe, Fidel Castro, all these people have implemented? Do we really believe, are we really convinced that something like that would lead South Africa down the road of prosperity? So we have this continuous justifying of this crime phenomenon by politicians and by people in the media. And sometimes you have a combination of the three, where someone would deny the existence of the problem and try to downplay it and try to justify it at once, which is ludicrous to say the least. Number 6, the link between farm murders and hate speech. Now, I wrote quite a bit about this again in the book, and I believe I've made some videos about this in the past, so I'm just going to give a few examples. So the argument is that we cannot prove that there's a link between farm murders and hate speech, or put more succinctly, that we are trying to prove such a link and we cannot prove this. Now, there's two things to be said about this, which might seem contradictory, so try to follow. In order for something to be hate speech, you do not need to prove that there is a link You do not need to prove that chanting "kill the Boer" necessarily results in a farmer being murdered or attacked. The existence of a causal link between saying something hateful that complies with the definition of hate speech and someone actually being attacked or assaulted as a result of this, you don't need to prove that. So it is not the argument of AfriForum or any of the other organizations that I listed above, or that are involved with this campaign that I'm aware of, that chants like "kill the Boer, kill the farmer" are hate speech because farmers are being attacked and killed as a result of this. It is not our argument. It's hate speech because it complies with the definition of hate speech. But there have been cases where it's quite evident to us from the circumstantial evidence that the attackers have been influenced by chants such as "kill the Boer, kill the farmer." And one is that of Ntutuko Chwene, who murdered a farmer in the early 90s, and he testified under oath that he committed this murder. He killed or murdered this farmer because he was influenced by the song "Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer." Another example is a guy called Knowledge Paulus Mandlazi, who in the Brits Rustenburg area had committed 5 farm murders. And in court he testified about this, and he said, "My hate for white people made me do it." He said that for him, killing white people is like going to work. Then we've had other cases. We've had examples of farm attackers chanting political slogans such as "Die white man, Viva Malema." We've had attackers cursing at the victims because of the fact that they are white, making political statements to them such as that apartheid is over. And even worse, we've had cases of writing slogans on the walls. In one case, at least one case, we had the farmers or the farm attackers writing "Dubula Ibunu," of course this chant or the song "Shoot the Boer," and I believe something like "Viva Malema" added to that on the doors of a farmhouse. There's even been worse cases of "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer" being written on the scene where the people were murdered and so forth. So with all of this circumstantial evidence, we still have people saying that there's no link, that we should not worry, that people can continue chanting this chant, "Kill the Boer," because there's no link between them chanting it and people actually being murdered, when this chant is being used on some of the crime scenes by the attackers. So number 7, I want to talk a bit about the way the media responds to this crime phenomenon. And there's much that could be said about this and many examples that we can use, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about the bigger picture. So with the writing of this book, we appointed a researcher to go through all the incidents of violence on farms that we could find, to put them all into a spreadsheet, list various variables, such as where did this happen, what time did it happen, the race of the perpetrator, the race of the victim, the levels of violence that were executed, the methods that were used, things that were said during the attack, and so forth. And then also, how did the media respond to this? Which media outlets reported on this, and how often? How many news reports did they publish? And so what we found, very interesting, is that the most important factor, if you consider everything that happens during an incidence of violence on a farm, if you consider all the criteria, all the factors, all the variables, the single most important variable that determines how the media will respond to this issue is the race of the perpetrator. Not the race of the victim, the race of the perpetrator. In fact, we have found that in cases based on this extensive database, incidents where the perpetrator is white and the victim is black is reported on or covered by the media 16 times as much as when it is the other way around. Despite the fact, or perhaps we should say because of the fact, that the extent to which white people inflict violence on farms on black people in South Africa is significantly lower than the extent to which black people inflict violence on farms on white people in South Africa. Now, I know this is a very controversial thing to say because it doesn't align with the narrative that I discussed earlier. But I'm not just making this as a bold statement. I'm referencing an extensive database on the extent to which the media is reporting on these attacks. Now, if you take away the over-reporting of certain cases and under-reporting of other cases, only counting of cases that was reported in the media, you would see that the extent to which the perpetrators are black and the victims are white is much higher than the extent to which the perpetrators are white and the victims are black. This is not something we would want to discuss, but we have to say this because the narrative currently is that it is the other way around. And we are being told that we have to believe that it is the other way around when all the evidence indicates to us that This is a lie. Now, the final point I want to get to is going forward. Now, for a start, we need to point out the hypocrisy and the immoral nature of journalists, political commentators, and members of the South African government trying to convince us that we are somehow the immoral ones if we say that this has to stop. This crime phenomenon where people are being attacked and killed in their houses, their wives, their children being killed in front of them, or the other way around, and where this is being romanticized by the government and downplayed by the media, if we want this to stop, we are somehow white supremacists and conspiracy theorists and all of this. We need to keep pointing out just how immoral it is to take that line of approach. And so that's the first thing we need to do. The second is that we need to keep following this double strategy with regard to farm murders. We are tax-paying citizens, and if you pay taxes, you should expect of the government to do its job. People are not safe in South Africa, despite us paying taxes for the government to keep us safe. But other than just people not being safe in general, we have this very unique, disproportionate crime phenomenon. And so within this context, we need to keep campaigning for the South African government to take this seriously. We need to keep fighting against politicians who encourage hate speech and who encourage these type of attacks through their own words, their speeches, and so forth. We need to keep raising awareness. We need to keep doing protest marches if that's what it takes, conferences, going abroad, talking to people, raising more awareness about this issue to pressure the South African government and the police to do something about this. But we should also recognize that we are in a particular reality, and that this particular reality is that there's not a reasonable prospect that the South African government would come to the table. So with that said, the most important part of what we ought to do now is not just campaigning politically, so to speak, but to look after our own safety, to start our own community safety structures, to become involved with these structures in whatever way our talents allow us to become involved, to have communication networks in rural areas and of course in urban areas, to have people drive patrols, to speak with each other, to make sure that you have a firearm and that if you have a firearm you are trained to properly use it, and all the other things that could be done to ensure that a community is kept safer. And the good news is there where communities actually do this, not just as disconnected individuals trying to protect themselves and their own houses, but as a community working together to ensure the safety of their community, we have seen over and over again that under these circumstances, it's the only and the most sustainable way of really making a difference and making our communities safer.